Hi everybody, it's Thursday, it's demo day, and we're coming to you live on Facebook from Now You're Cooking. We have our good friend Jim Amaral from Borealis Breads tonight, and he's going to get all sciencey and talk about sourdough starter. Before we get into that, I just want to mention that we are doing homemade gnocchi next week with John Edgerton, my big brother, who is the gentleman farmer in Maine, so that's going to be really fun. And we're still open 10 to 5, 10 to 4 on Sundays, 10 to 5 every other day, and would love to see you here in the store. So let's get, and don't forget Jim's awesome book, Cookbook for Bread, if you are into bread baking. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
How are you?
Fabulous to be here again and talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is sourdough. And I've started Borealis Breads, 27 years ago. And for 27 years, we've been making almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost sourdough breads. So we're going to talk about starters today. We're not going to talk about the bread making. We're going to talk about how to start a starter, how to feed a starter, how to kill a starter, because that's always good to know. And if you get really frustrated, you can kill it, and then you don't have to deal with it anymore. And all the esoterica around sourdough starters. So, to start, I want to talk a little bit about ingredients, because a sourdough starter is really just two ingredients: flour and water. And the quality of the ingredients really does make a difference. So I recommend that when you're starting a starter, that you use organic flour. Hasn't been treated with all sorts of chemicals in the field. The grains haven't been treated with all sorts of chemicals in the field. And there's not likely to be anything in the flour that might inhibit the growth of the yeast or the bacteria that we are looking to encourage to grow. I should probably take a step back and say, what is a starter? So a starter is basically flour, water, and yeast, which produces CO2, and you can see bubbles in most of these containers. That's carbon dioxide that's been produced by the yeast, and it's what leavens your bread, so that you see all those air holes in your crumb. Those pockets of air are created by the yeast that are producing CO2. So a sourdough starter is yeast, but it's more than that. So if it were just yeast, it would in some ways be very similar to a commercial yeast that a baker might use in the bakery. But in addition to the yeast, sourdough starters have bacteria. Most of them are some variety of lactobacillus, although there are some other varieties as well. And the bacteria will produce lactic and acetic acid. So the sourness isn't produced by the yeast, it's produced by the bacteria that are also fermenting in the sourdough starter. Quality of ingredients is hugely important. Recommend organic flours when you're starting your starter. Once it's up and running and it's healthy and you're using it on a regular basis, if you want to use non-organic ingredients, that's fine. But when you're first getting it started, I would recommend using organic bread flour, organic whole wheat flour, organic rye flour. And then the other ingredient we don't think much about is water. And water comes from a variety of sources, some of which yeast and bacteria like well water or spring water, but other sources that they don't necessarily like. So if you're on town water and that water is being treated at a water treatment facility, it's often treated with chlorine. Chlorine is an antifungal agent, so it makes your yeast really unhappy and not do what they're supposed to do. So if you're using town water, I would recommend you can let it sit out for overnight and all the chlorine in it will dissipate. The problem is that a lot of towns treat their water with many other types of water purification and water softening agents. They use the water softening agents to change the pH of the water so that the pipes in town last much longer. When we opened up our bakery in Wells, we went from using well water like we do in Waldoboro to town water in Wells, and it took me 2 weeks to figure out that the reason my starters weren't working was because the town was treating the water not only with chlorine, which I knew, and we had put in charcoal filtration system to remove the chlorine, but they were using other water softeners, and we ended up having to use bottled spring water to mix our starters, and then once the starters were fully fermenting, we could use regular town water to mix our bread doughs. And then eventually we put in a reverse osmosis filter to remove all that stuff that was in the water. So you want to make sure your water source is good. You want to make sure your containers are clean, because if there is oil or soap film or anything like that, that can also inhibit the yeast and the bacteria. So good clean containers, good ingredients, and then you're good to go in regards to mixing up your starter. So,
can I ask a question while you're drinking water? Two things. If you have questions at home, if you want to type them in while we're doing it live, once it's recorded, we'll try to answer questions too. But if you do it while we're recording, we can try to get Jim to answer them. Do you need to make sure that your containers are sanitized like you do for canning something? Like, do you need to boil it and stuff?
Not really. You just want to make sure, because you just want to make sure they're really well rinsed. Some people will use, they'll clean their containers and then rinse them with water and baking soda solution to remove any soap film or anything like that. I've never done that and find that it's not really necessary. But you don't want to just, wash it and then not give it a good rinse and use it and wonder why your starter isn't doing what it's supposed to do. So, so I have two starters here. I have a white starter, which is water and white bread flour, and I have a Dazum starter, which is a whole wheat starter. But we're going to start with the white starter, and it's really easy to mix up. It's almost embarrassingly easy, because it's basically, as I said, flour and water. So I'm going to take 100 grams. So the hydration on this, so it's basically equal parts by weight of water and flour. So I'm going to do 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water.
And it's helpful if you have a good scale that measures grams, because it's really small. You don't want to guess on this, right? You want it to be pretty close.
Particularly for somebody who's not used to baking and what things should look like, it's so much easier when you can just be accurate in terms of your measuring. So we've got 100 grams of flour, and then I'm going to add 100 grams of water.
Slowly, because you can't take it back.
You cannot take it back.
But if you're off by 100th of a gram,
or even 5 grams, or to be honest, oh my God, I'm off by 2 grams. So just to remind people, there are 28 grams in an ounce. So being off by 2 grams is really not a big deal. So I'm going to mix this up and create what I would call, when you've got this high a hydration where it's equal parts flour and water, I would call it a batter. And as you can see, I'm starting a sourdough starter from scratch. I've mixed up my flour and water, and I'm not adding any starter to this. What I'm going to do is keep it covered, lightly covered. Remember that it's going to hopefully ferment, so it'll be producing CO2. So you can put cheesecloth over it, or a damp towel, or a loosely fitting lid. And this container here, I mixed at 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, and you can see that, and I didn't add any starter to this, I didn't add any yeast to it. You can see that it's bubbling away already.
And that's just from the natural yeast in the air.
That's from the natural yeast that was either in the flour itself or in the air. Now, I have to be honest. I bake bread in my kitchen at least once, usually twice a week. My kitchen is saturated with yeast, so it might be cheating a little to do it in my kitchen, but I can guarantee you there's yeast in your kitchen. As much cleaning as you have done, I don't care how much you've done, there is yeast in your kitchen. There is yeast in your flour. There is bacteria in your flour, if it's organic. And if you mix it up, put it in a container, it can be a ceramic container, it can be a stainless steel container, it can be a glass container. I like using glass because you can see how it's fermenting. It'll move up the this is just a canning jar, and I put a rubber band where the original level was when I first put it in, and then you can tell how much it's moved over a given period of time.
And you started this 2 days
Wednesday
ago?
at 9:30.
Yesterday morning.
Yep.
Nice. That's
Yep.
amazing.
Yep. So, one of the important variables here is that you want the temperatures are really important. So, if you mix up your starter, your flour and your water, and you have it at 50 degrees, it's not going to get going because the yeast and the bacteria operate best in a certain range of temperatures. That temperature range is generally between 70 degrees and 85 degrees. So if you do this in the wintertime, you need to find, if your kitchen is cool like mine is, you need to find a warm spot to do it in and to store it. And likewise, if it's summertime and it's really, really hot, you need maybe put it in your basement where it's a little bit cooler and it doesn't get too hot. And as with any yeast fermentation, and actually this is true with bacteria fermentations to a point, the warmer the temperature, the faster it's going to ferment. So between 70 and 85 degrees is your window for ideal temperatures for the yeast and bacteria.
So when you mix the water in there,
Yep.
I saw you earlier and you were taking its temperature. So are you adding it at that temperature too? Do you want to make sure your tap water, your spring water is...
I could, I've got a temperature gauge here. Your flour is going to be whatever the ambient temperature in your kitchen is. So if your kitchen temperature is 74 degrees, then you would just want to throw in 74 degree water or 75, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And so we're at 76 degrees.
So you don't want to shock with hot or cold water. You just want to make sure it's about...
Yeah, I mean, it really doesn't matter, but it would be really unusual. I guess if somebody was storing their flour in their freezer, they would probably have to add 95 degree water to get it. And it doesn't matter because the population of yeast and bacteria is so tiny that the temperature range really isn't going to matter. And it's going to reach an equilibrium of mid-70s very, very quickly. So, and that's what this is really all about, is population dynamics. You're trying to go from a situation where there are very few yeast cells, very few bacteria, and give them the optimum conditions so that they're going to say, we're having a great time, we like this neighborhood, we're moving in, we're having families, and we are just going to overpopulate this piece of flour and water. And
it's a yeast party.
It's a yeast party, absolutely. Okay, so that's one. So I next want to look at what this starter should look like at various stages. So I've lined up three different, the starter that was mixed at three different times. The first one here was mixed at 7 a.m. this morning. And it was basically, I believe, 50 grams of starter that I had pulled from my refrigerator. And then 150 grams of water and 150 grams of flour. And as you can see, so we're talking 10 hours later, and that is nice and bubbly. You're starting to see some foam right here. This is ready to use, and there's a good way to tell. So if you're wondering about how to tell if a starter like this is ready to use, sorry, water. Hate to do this to you. You take your starter, you put it in a container of water, and if it floats, it means it's producing enough gas that it will leaven your bread. If it sinks to the bottom, it means that it's not producing enough gas. So for example, if I were to take some of this starter that was mixed many days ago and to put it in, you can see it drops right to the bottom. So I could not use this particular starter for perfect. I couldn't use this starter that was mixed on 9 a.m. Tuesday morning because it's been fully fermented. If you look at it, there are no bubbles, and when you use a starter, you want maximum activity on the part of the yeast and the bacteria, and the best way to tell that is how bubbly it is.
So, sorry, does that now just get put in the compost, or can you use it?
No, so I could take this and I could add flour and water. I could take 50 grams and add, or I'm only usually keeping 50 grams in the refrigerator. So I would take maybe 10 grams and then add 30 grams of water, 30 grams of flour, mix it up, and let it ferment.
So we have not killed this. It's just a coma.
I did talk about killing the starter earlier, and I will tell you ways to kill it. But because this is an advanced sourdough class, in my basic sourdough classes, I don't tell you how to kill it. But the yeast and bacteria are incredibly resilient. So you could leave this out for a week and there would still be yeast and bacteria there, and if you fed it, they would come back. They might be dormant at the moment and the population would drop significantly, but there's still yeast and bacteria in there. In general, so let's talk just timing wise a little bit, because we've got another one here. So this was mixed at 11 p.m. on Wednesday. So this was last night. And you can see the difference between these two. So the bubbles are still many, many, many bubbles. There's a little bit of foam around the edges. Nice lactic aroma on both of these. This one is a little more aromatic. And I believe that if we do the test, the water test on this one here that I mixed last night, that this should pass the float test. Yep. If anything, I would say this one is a little bit young, and this one is just a little bit over, but they're both still usable. And so just to give you an idea of consistency, you can see this, how it kind of glops off in pieces. But it still stretches out quite a ways before it does that. This one's going to come off in more of a stream. A little longer stretch to it. And then this one here is just liquid. Yep. So that's one way to test. I mean, this is the ideal test if you're talking about testing it for using it for bread baking, but you can also tell there's the visual cues in terms of the number of bubbles. Is it foamy? And there's also that visual cue as to what it looks like coming off a spoon when you dip a spoon into it.
Would there be a difference? Like, would you be able to tell the difference taste or texture-wise between these two, or is it okay to just make your bread with
this
younger?
So if you use a younger starter or one that's if you don't take it at its absolute prime, when you take it at its absolute prime, that's when you're going to get the most amount of leavening. So your bread's going to rise to its highest point with starter that's at just the right stage. Yeah. Now that right stage, it's not. You have to take that starter at 11:59, and if you don't take it then, it's not gonna be as good. There's probably a 2 to 4 5-hour window that you're talking about, depending on if it's warmer out, it's in the 80s. That window will be a little bit shorter. If it's cooler, it would be a little bit longer. But you'd probably be hard pressed to tell the difference between the breads made with either of these. If I made bread with both of these starters, and they'd probably look very similar. Yep.
I'm learning a lot. I hope you guys are.
I hope so too.
I've never made sourdough bread before, so and I know a lot of people get into it.
So do we have any questions coming in at all?
Not that I've seen so much.
Okay. Geez, wow. Okay.
They might come later though.
So let me talk just about the schedule with this particular starter. So this starter I generally use once a week, and most people I know are baking regularly. They're usually baking once a week or maybe once every other week. So you can use this starter. So say I were to take this starter, I'm ready to use it. The first thing I do is weigh out 50 grams and put it in the refrigerator. So I know I have my starter saved for the next time.
So if we're starting with the one that you just made, that one's going to sit out, the one over there.
Yep.
100 grams, 100 grams,
yep.
102 grams. What's going to happen with that? We're going to put it in one of these containers with some cheesecloth or something over it, and it's sitting out on the counter?
That is going to sit out there for probably 3 or 4 days, and you're going to want to...
It'll look like that.
And it's going to look like this, and you're going to want to have it come up the glass, and then it'll start, as it loses its leavening power, it's going to start to come down the glass, and that's when you want to take 50 grams of it, add 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, and feed it again. It's a new starter, so it needs to be fed on a regular basis. It's not something you want to say, oh, it's rising now, I can just throw it in the refrigerator. And I would probably do that 3 or 4 times before I were to start using it.
So will all of that fit in here as you keep feeding it, or should it be in a larger?
So basically what's going to happen is, so say I've got 200 grams. I would take 50 out, and I would mix that for my next starter. The 150 I have left here, I would either use in pancakes or crackers or something. I'd use it somewhere else.
Okay, so
or I would discard it.
You're going to start using that. Then you take your newly fed, which is in its own new jar with its new flour.
So I would take 50 grams of this, 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, mix it up, put it in a different jar.
Start from scratch.
And yes, put it in, and then let that ferment, and then this gets discarded.
Right, and then a couple of days later, that one.
Same thing. Take 50 grams out.
Thing,
yep.
And just do it again, and eat lots of sourdough pancakes.
Yes. Great. Absolutely. So, and if it doesn't work the first time, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Just try it again and just go over those procedures I talked about. Is the water good? Are my flour ingredients good? Was the temperature okay? Did I have clean containers? Did I not put it in a window where it heats up to 120 degrees? Because that is, if you want to kill a sourdough starter, if you heat it up really hot, 120 degrees, 130 degrees, that will kill it. That will kill the bacteria. I don't know if it'll kill the bacteria. It'll definitely kill the yeast. So that's one way to kill them. Now,
I'm going to interrupt you one last time,
Sure.
and then I'm going to let you get back into your flow. At what point after we feed it, take out 50 grams, feed that, take out 50 grams, feed that, when do we say, okay, this is ready?
I would say after 3 times. So it's consistently, on a container like this, it would be consistently coming up to here probably.
Yeah.
And every time you do it, it's doing that. And
So third time, put
Third
a
time.
tight
you never put a tight cover on because remember the yeast is producing CO2, so
Right, you don't want
you're going to pressurize that bottle. But if it's this kind of temperatures in the 70s and it's working, it's coming up within a 12-hour period and it's coming up fairly far up the glass, then it's probably just fine.
Okay, so you put on a loosely, or you
Yep.
keep it with the cheesecloth. How do you keep it in the fridge?
I usually put just a loosely covered lid on it. I use just a glass jar with a plastic lid on it. I mean, they're not super tight, and it's fine.
Okay, now you can get back into your rhythm.
Okay. Yes. So for those folks who are not baking on a weekly basis, that starter that you have in the refrigerator, it can stay there for up to a month probably. It's going to look really gnarly. There's probably going to be this grayish, ugly looking water on top. Just stir that in, and then when you use it, that starter, you're probably going to have to feed it at least 2 times to get it fully regenerated. Whereas if you were using it on a weekly basis, I find some people say, you should pull your starter from the refrigerator, mix it, let it rise once, give it a boost, and then use it. I find, at least the starters I'm using, that all I have to do is pull them from the refrigerator, feed them once, and then when they're fully fermented, they are ready to go. They're fine. And remember, so commercial yeast is one kind of yeast. It's Saccharomyces, and here's the science part, kids, for those of you who like science. Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Bread makers originally got their yeast prior to science. They got it from the brewers, and it was the yeast that the brewers were skimming off the top of the ale tanks, which was Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So it's a single variety of yeast that produces a lot of gas and is good for leavening bread. Now, in a sourdough starter, you may have a different variety of yeast. So it may have a different flavor profile because the yeast are actually, in addition to the CO2 they're producing, they're also producing other flavors that are going to impact the bread as well as the bacteria. So a wild yeast may produce different flavor profile than a commercial yeast. So, and typically sourdough breads have much more complex flavors than you would get from a simple bread that's made with commercial yeast. So now for those of you who are like, okay, I'm going away for 6 months, I'm going to Tuscany, and I'm going to eat good Italian bread, and I don't know what to do with my starter, you can freeze it. The starter will freeze just fine. You pull it out of the freezer 6 months, you feed it 2 or 3 times, and it's going to be good to go again. And amazingly, you see this stuff? This is that starter, and I just took that starter, took a pastry brush, painted it over parchment paper, or you can just paint it on a cookie sheet, and you stick it in a warm sunny spot. It dries, and then you break it up, and you have your own dried yeast. Instant dried sourdough starter. So you can then take this, and again, I would feed it a couple times. I would take a tablespoon of this with 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, mix it in, let it rise, feed it, do that whole thing where you take 50 grams of it, feed it with water and flour, and do that a couple times, and then it should be ready to use. And this will last for decades.
Because it's dried.
Because it's dried.
That's amazing.
Yep. The bacteria and yeast are dormant, and it's not freeze dried, but it's dried. It'll last a long time.
That is so cool. I've never heard of doing that before. That's really
You heard it here first, folks. And I told you this was an advanced sourdough class, and I wasn't kidding. So if nobody has questions about white sourdough, I am going to talk about my favorite sourdough. And I know these are my babies, and I know you're not supposed to have favorites when it comes to your children, but I'm a bad parent, and I do have favorites. So we are going to talk about a Dazum starter, which is a Flemish-style starter. Oh, wait a minute. Cut. Stop. I want to get back to white starter. So, when you're feeding, this starter is incredibly versatile. So, it doesn't need to just be white flour. And in fact, if you're having trouble fermenting it, you can add a little bit of rye flour to it. Rye flour is really highly fermentable, so it tends, if you have a little bit of rye flour in there, it tends to ferment quicker. But you can also use non-traditional flours. You can use a mixture of bread flour and say something like this, which is buckwheat flour. This is 100% hydration, but if you wanted something that's fermenting a little bit more slowly, you say, okay, I want to mix it tonight, but I'm not going to be able to get back to it till tomorrow night, 24 hours later. If you mix it at, say, 70% hydration, so 70 grams of water for every 100 grams of flour, you're going to have a more dough-like consistency. And because the hydration is lower, it's going to ferment less quickly. And so it'll extend that fermentation a little bit. And we'll talk about how, if it's a dough-like consistency to your starter, how you might check for that. Because you can still do the float test, but it's just like checking a proofing bread, really. So.
Someone had a question. If you have a gluten intolerance, they've heard that you can eat sourdough. Do you have an opinion about that?
I'll tell you what I have heard and from talking to a nutritionist.
So the question was, if you have a gluten intolerance, can you eat sourdough?
Okay. So if you have celiac disease, no, because your body just can't process the protein gluten, and it doesn't work. But if you have trouble digesting wheat for other reasons, I've been told by nutritionists that breads made with sourdough starters are much more digestible, and particularly if they've gone through a long fermentation period. So at Borealis Breads, for example, from the time we mix our starters to the time the bread goes into the oven is typically 24 to 30 hours. And in fact, I was at the Brunswick Farmers Market last week. A woman said, "Oh, I have so much trouble with bread. It gives me gas, but I love it." I said, "Here, try here's a slice of Italian bread. Take it home, try it." And she texted me yesterday and said, "I ate your bread and I had no problems. It was delicious and I felt fine." And so she's a perfect example of somebody who, doesn't deal well with just regular commercial bread, but if it's a sourdough bread, she's fine. Yep. So great question.
Yeah, good question. And one more quickie. You mentioned bread flour. Are you using bread flour or all-purpose flour? Does it make a difference?
It doesn't make a difference.
Okay, just flour.
All-purpose flour is usually 11% protein, and you can make bread with it just fine. I would recommend, again, a high-quality bread flour. So in this area, typically, I would tell people to King Arthur is probably your best bet in terms of just something you can find at the supermarket. But it can be bread flour. It can be all-purpose flour. I wouldn't recommend using, you could get a starter going with pastry flour or cake flour. They tend to be processed a little bit more. And actually, the cake flour definitely is heavily bleached. You don't want to use a flour that's bleached and bromated. So the thing about white flours is that they need to go through an oxidation process before they can be used for bread making. And rather than have a lot of money tied up with pallets of flour sitting on a warehouse floor for a month before it can be used, American flour producers will bleach and bromate their flour, and it artificially oxidizes the flour so they can go right from the mill. It was milled one day, it gets shipped out the next, and then the next day it's on supermarket shelves. Now, the Europeans will tell you that that particularly bromates are cancer causing and they don't recommend it. And of course, King Arthur has always made their reputation on we never bleach or bromate our flour. So I wouldn't use a bleached or bromated. So if you're using, I wouldn't use like Gold Medal flour or one of the big national brands like that. But an organic flour or a locally milled flour or King Arthur or something like that, a higher quality, works well.
That's good to know.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to talk about Dazum. That's Desem starter. And it's a Flemish style starter. For those of you who are really old like I am, unlike Louisa, who's very young and probably never heard of this book, there's a book that was first published, I think, in the early 80s called Laurel's Bread Book. She's famous for having done Laurel's Kitchen, but she also did a bread book called Laurel's Bread Book. She has a whole big section on breads made with Dazum starters. And again, going way back, for those of you folks who grew up in Massachusetts, there was a bakery, Baldwin Hill Bakery in Western Mass, back in the 80s and 90s that was making sourdough breads with the Dazum starter. And it's just got a whole different profile, flavor profile, and it's just flour. It's 6 parts whole wheat flour to 10 parts. So basically, whatever your flour is 100%, and then you want 60% in terms of your water. So, and the process for starting this is a little intimidating, and I'm gonna send you guys the actual recipe because it takes about 2 weeks to do it, but it's really remarkable. So I came into the store on Monday and I mixed up the starter, mixed up the flour and water. There was no starter there, and I buried it in this container, which has about 8 pounds of whole wheat flour in it. And you can see the crevices, which means that is a great sign because it means that the ball of dough that I put in there has grown and lifted that flour up and created those crevices. That's me. Sorry. So that ball of dough has been inoculated with the bacteria and yeast that were growing on the wheat, that was on the wheat that was milled.
That's so cool.
So if you want to create a starter that really reflects the microbiology of a particular farm or area, this is a great way to do it. So this flour, all of our whole wheat flour at the bakery comes from Aurora Mills and Farm up in Aroostook County. So we've transported yeast and bacteria from Aroostook County to Bath, and it is fermenting this ball of dough. So I'm going to pull this ball out so you can take a look at it.
So is it, when you put it in, is it just like 3 or 4 inches down, or?
I try to get it halfway down the container. Look at that. It's like
Was
prehistoric.
It ball when you put it in there? Like
It was a round ball.
And so it's got
Yep.
all these growths on it.
Yep.
That's so cool.
Yep. So let me just grab a knife here. So look at that. You can see all the bubbles in there. Take a whiff.
Oh, wow.
So
That's very interesting.
So what I would do, and this probably was ready from the look of this on the inside, I probably could have come in yesterday and used this. So I'm just going to take, I don't want the crusty part, I just want the parts that are, I just want that nice moist dough on the inside.
Can you scoop it out with your fingers, or is that too?
You could. It's very, very sticky.
Okay.
And so actually, where's my
Spoon?
yeah, right there. Oh, those handy two-sided spoons, so I can do white starter on one, and I'm gonna just stick that in there.
And that dried stuff just goes.
It just gets thrown out. You could leave it out in the yard for the turkeys if you wanted. I'm sure they would love it.
Or you could compost it.
Or you could compost it, sure. Okay. So I don't have very much here, but that's plenty. And I'm going to add, we'll see how much it is, but I'm going to add, probably 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour. I don't want too big a ball of dough because I'm going to stick it back in here. So.
And is this like the white one? You're going to do this 3 or 4 times, or 2 or 3 times?
This is going to be a little more involved. So.
Okay. You go at your own pace.
This is. So this mixed it on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It was Monday morning, so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So almost 4 days. I probably could have done it in 3. And now I'm going to mix it up again, and I'm sure that within 2 days it'll be fully fermented. So let's.
So you made this with the same flour that you're going to add to
Yes.
it? Okay. And
Yep.
is that the same as this one?
Yeah, they're both from
Both from
Aurora
the same.
Mills.
Okay.
Yep. So let's just see how much this is. Yeah, so 37 grams, and I'm gonna go with 100. Actually, yeah, 100 should be fine. $101.
Oh, now it's
Jeez.
102.
Oh, 102. And so 60 grams of water. So I'm actually just going to do this by hand.
And do you use this for the same kind of bread? Would you use this more for wheat breads or rye breads, like darker breads, or?
You could use it for any kind of bread. I tend to use it for breads that have more whole grains in them. Like, I wouldn't use this for a baguette.
Yeah.
A sourdough baguette. But they are, in some ways, they can be interchangeable. If I were making a focaccia, I would use the white starter probably, but if I'm making a bread with some whole rye or cornmeal, I'd be likely to use this starter instead.
And did you say that this one is always done with a darker flour?
It's always made with whole wheat.
With whole wheat.
Whole wheat flour, 100% whole wheat flour. And this one, you don't want the temperature to be over 70 degrees. Ideally 65 to 70 degrees. So there's my ball of dough. And like that. And I am just going to bury it and just really get it as far down as I can. Top it off.
And I think I asked you this before we started filming, but can you use this flour after it's gone through
Absolutely.
all of its...
Yep. No problem
So
at all.
you're not wasting your flour
You're
by
not.
making-
Not at all. Nope. So, you saw what that ball of dough looked like. I mean, it was a ball of whole wheat dough. So this is what the starter looks like after it's I mixed this one at 11 p.m. on Wednesday, and you can see that there's a tiny little bit of spring back here, but really not significant. So I would consider this a little bit overproof for using it for bread. But again, I think that if I were to take, let's see what happens when we take a piece of this and put it in the water. We'll use this water here.
How long has this been out of its flour home?
Oh, I started that starter back in 1995.
Okay. It's been a little while.
All right, so that did not float. And to be honest, I haven't really tested this bread with the float test, so it's more like a dough. So the poke test, what I call the poke test, if that poked it and it sprang back a little bit but left a little bit of an indentation, that would tell me it's ready. And when you opened it up, you would see all the air pockets and the bubbles in there. I would know that that's good to go.
So that's heading towards that.
Yeah.
The runny.
Yep. Yep.
Not as...
So yeah, I would not be likely to use this. I would probably refreshen it up and then use it.
But again, it's not dead. It's just in a
No,
coma.
it's
So
exactly.
you can bring it back.
Exactly. It's not even in a coma yet. So, so ways you can kill, as I promised, ways you can kill your starters. Use water that's highly chlorinated with lots of other chemicals in there, and I guarantee you that'll probably kill your starter. High heat will kill your starter. Really hard to kill your starter with cold, because you can stick it in the freezer and it's still going to be, still can rejuvenate it. You can flush it down the toilet. That will kill it.
And you'll lose it.
And if you're feeling so desperate that you feel like you have to flush your starter down the toilet, please call me and I can talk you through it, and we'll make sure that we get you a healthy starter that's good for bread making.
There is a helpline for sourdough, folks.
Okay. So I think that covers all the basics. Let's see if we've got any questions here. As I said, I'll make sure you guys have the recipes for both of these tomorrow. And so you can post them on the website.
Cool. And if people have questions too, if you come up with questions, if you're watching this next week or next month or next year or whatever, email us and we can email Jim and get answers to your questions. Jim is awesome at helping.
And shameless promotion here. I'm at the Bath Farmers Market most Saturdays from 9 to noon. And you can always stop by and say, hey, Jim, I was trying this with my starter. It didn't work, and I can help you out. And also tomorrow, we are doing fiddlehead focaccia. And it's to die for. And we only have it for 2 weeks because the fiddleheads aren't around for very long. And I think I've only got enough dough to make 15 focaccias. So if you want to get a fiddlehead focaccia, you might want to stop by the market early.
So tomorrow...
tomorrow is Saturday.
Saturday
Yes.
here.
And actually, we'll also have it tomorrow in Bath. In Brunswick, on the Common in Brunswick. So,
nice.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
If there are any questions, like I said, please feel free to post them on Facebook, email us, call us, contact Jim. He's awesome about helping people with questions about bread. He loves what he does.
I do.
So another shameless promotion. Here's Jim's book, Borealis Breads, which are most of the recipes are with Maine grains.
A lot of them have Maine grown grains, and so half the book is bread recipes, including sourdough recipes, and the other half of the book my co-author helped with, and she has all sorts of incredible salads and sauces and dips and spreads that go well with breads.
With your breads.
Yep.
And as he said, there's sourdough recipe in here and sourdough starter recipe. Yep. So there's that. Next week we are making homemade gnocchi with the gentleman farmer in Maine. So catch us next week, which will be the 27th. And we will see you then. Thanks for joining us.